In 1998, on a quiet afternoon far away from the cameras, Michael Jackson made a decision that most people never even noticed. He didn't announce it at a press conference. He didn't put it in a magazine interview. He simply asked one question to a 20-year-old actor who had once been the most famous child star on the planet. "Will you be the godfather of my daughter?" That actor was Macaulay Culkin. The daughter was Paris Jackson, just a few months old at the time. Think about that for a second. Michael Jackson knew royalty. He knew presidents. He knew the biggest names in music, film, and business. He had access to any lawyer, any bodyguard, any powerful family friend he wanted. And when it came to choosing someone to protect his child's future, someone who would step in if the unthinkable ever happened, he skipped all of them. He chose a former child actor who understood something almost nobody else on earth could understand. Not a business partner, not a relative, not a fellow superstar. A 20-year-old man who, in many ways, was still trying to figure out who he was after growing up in front of the entire world. The real reason goes back years earlier to two boys who were never really allowed to be boys at all. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button because this channel digs up the stories hidden behind the headlines. Now let's get into it. The real reason Michael Jackson chose Macaulay Culkin had nothing to do with Hollywood connections or publicity. It had everything to do with recognition. Michael did not choose people because they were famous. He chose people because they understood what fame had actually cost him. Most of the adults around Michael, managers, business partners, even some relatives, saw him as an asset before they saw him as a person. Every relationship came with a small, quiet question hanging in the background. What does this person actually want from me? Macaulay Culkin never gave Michael a reason to ask that question because Macaulay Culkin had already lived through the exact same machine and had nothing left to gain by using him. He wasn't just a fan. He wasn't just a friend visiting a famous neighbor for the novelty of it. He was someone who had already survived the thing Michael feared most for his own children. A childhood consumed entirely by fame, cameras, and other people's expectations. So when Michael pictured his daughter growing up, surrounded by people who wanted something from her, he didn't picture an executive or a bodyguard standing beside her. He pictured the one person who had once stood exactly where his own children would one day stand, and had made it out the other side still recognizably himself. To understand why he trusted him that much, you have to go back to a boy who became famous almost overnight, and very nearly disappeared because of it. At just 10 years old, he became the most recognizable kid on the planet after the release of Home Alone in 1990. Overnight, a normal boy from New York was thrown into a world of premieres, magazine covers, and a level of scrutiny most adults never experience in an entire lifetime. His face was suddenly on lunchboxes, posters, and magazine racks. His name was suddenly worth millions of dollars to studios who had barely known who he was a year earlier. By the time he was a teenager, Macaulay was reportedly exhausted, both by the demands of the industry and by pressures building at home. His parents were locked in a bitter, highly public legal battle over control of his earnings, a fight that played out in courtrooms and tabloids at the same time. He was a kid whose entire identity had quietly turned into a product before he even had the chance to understand what that meant for him. He eventually stepped back from acting almost entirely in his late teens, walking away from a career most people would have killed for. People close to him at the time suggested he simply needed to figure out who he was. Outside of a character audiences already thought they knew. That is the world Michael Jackson recognized instantly, because it had been his world too, just a few years earlier and on an even bigger stage. The two first met in the late 1980s when Macaulay was still a young child and Michael was already one of the biggest stars in music history. Michael reportedly reached out after seeing some of Macaulay's early film work, and the two struck up a friendship that confused a lot of outsiders looking in from the outside. People close to them say the bond made sense once you looked past the age difference. Michael didn't treat Macaulay like a fan, and he didn't treat him like a mini-celebrity to be photographed with for headlines. He treated him like an equal, someone who simply understood the pressure of being watched every single moment of his life, on set, at school, even walking down the street. Macaulay would later describe their friendship as one built on a shared understanding that almost nobody else could offer him. Two people who had each lost a normal childhood to global fame, sitting in a room together, finally able to just be ordinary around one another, without performing for anyone. Over the years, the friendship grew steadily rather than fading the way most celebrity friendships do. Macaulay visited Neverland Ranch many times throughout his adolescence. He was there during some of the most difficult and heavily scrutinized periods of Michael's life, including stretches when other people in Michael's circle had already started quietly distancing themselves to protect their own reputations. Macaulay reportedly stayed close anyway, even when staying close came with public criticism and uncomfortable questions from journalists. That kind of loyalty, unpaid and unglamorous, is rare in that world. And Michael noticed it. Everything changed when Michael became a father. Those who knew him say fatherhood softened him in ways that surprised even people who had known him for decades. He became fiercely protective, almost paranoid, about who was allowed close to his children, insisting on veils, careful scheduling, and tightly controlled appearances in public. Money didn't buy trust anymore in Michael's eyes. Fame definitely didn't either. He had learned the hard way that both of those things could just as easily attract people who wanted to use his children as they could attract people who genuinely wanted to protect them. So when it came time to choose the people who would stand watch over his son and daughters, Michael didn't reach for business partners, industry executives, or even every member of his own extended family. He reached for the small handful of people who had proven, over years and without being asked, that they cared about him before they ever cared about his fame or his fortune. Macaulay Culkin was one of the very few people who passed that test completely, and he had passed it long before Michael ever needed to rely on him. Now picture the moment itself. It's 1998. Michael Jackson has just become a father for the first time to a daughter named Paris. New parents often think carefully about who they want standing beside their child if something ever happens to them. Michael was no different, except his version of that question came loaded with a level of pressure most parents never have to consider. Whoever he chose would need to understand global fame from the inside, protect a child's privacy instinctively, and never once see his daughter as anything other than simply a person. He turned to Macaulay Culkin, then just 20 years old himself, and asked him to be Paris's godfather. Macaulay said yes. For years, this stayed a quiet, almost entirely private detail, mentioned nowhere in interviews or magazine profiles. It wasn't confirmed publicly until much later, long after Michael's death, when Culkin himself finally spoke about the role in interviews. He described the friendship with real warmth, defending Michael against years of public mockery and criticism, and confirming that yes, he was in fact the godfather Michael Jackson had chosen for his little girl back in 1998. Long after Michael's death in 2009, as Paris Jackson grew into her teenage years and then adulthood, largely under intense public attention of her own, Macaulay Culkin didn't disappear from her life the way distant celebrity connections usually do. Reports and interviews over the years suggest he remained a quiet, steady presence in the background, exactly the kind of protective figure Michael had hoped for back in 1998. Paris has spoken publicly about her godfather with real affection, describing him as someone who checked in on her, who understood her world in a way almost nobody else around her could, having lived through a version of it himself. In a strange twist of fate, the very thing Michael feared most, his children growing up surrounded by people who didn't understand what fame does to a young person, was the exact thing Macaulay Culkin was uniquely built to help prevent. The boy who once nearly disappeared into a role at 10 years old grew into the adult who helped make sure Michael's daughter never had to disappear the same way. So why did Michael Jackson make Macaulay Culkin the godfather of his children? Not because of Hollywood status, not because of publicity, and certainly not because it made a good headline, because for years, almost nobody even knew. He did it because Macaulay Culkin was one of the only people on earth who understood firsthand and without needing it explained exactly what Michael was trying to protect his children from. A childhood swallowed whole by fame, a life lived entirely in front of an audience that never stopped watching. A world where almost nobody around you wants something except your money, your attention, or a single photograph. When Michael had to choose someone to help guard the one thing he cared about more than his career, more than his music, more than his own legacy, he looked past the entire industry and chose the one person who had already survived what he feared most. It might be one of the quietest, most honest decisions Michael Jackson ever made. And for a long time, almost nobody even knew he had made it. It also leaves one lingering question. A man surrounded by millions of fans, dozens of powerful friends, and an entire industry built around his name, trusted almost none of them with the safety of his own children. What does that tell you about the world he was really trying to protect them from? If this story changed how you see Michael Jackson and Macaulay Culkin's friendship, that's the point. So if you haven't already, hit subscribe right now, because this channel digs up the stories hidden behind the headlines, and there's a lot more like this coming. And tell me in the comments, did you know Macaulay Culkin was Paris Jackson's godfather? And do you think Michael made the right call?